recklesslaw.com.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Yes!
This is the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
He's a great guy.
Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
All right, here we are, my favorite day of the week. It's Thursday. I'm Ross. Thanks so much for spending a little of your morning with me. So let's talk a little bit. I'm not going to do the whole show on this. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened in Louisville, Kentucky yesterday and then last night following the announcement of the grand jury findings regarding whether the police officers involved in the shooting of Breonna Taylor would face any criminal charges for that event. By the way, we're up on YouTube right now. If you go to youtube.com and type in my name, which would be Ross Kaminsky with a Y on the end, then, well, I don't know. I don't know what. You'll get to see me in my home studio and my wife's painting on the wall. So, going into the grand jury, we had heard some news stories, and I'm not going to say that I kept completely on top of this story as much as I might have, for example, if it had been here in Denver, but what we heard was that one police officer in particular seemed at risk because this guy apparently fired maybe 10 rounds into a dark room where he couldn't even see what he was shooting at, and just firing kind of blindly into a room. And it seemed to me that that guy had some real risk. It was also unclear to me, based on reports of how many times Miss Taylor was hit with bullets, and we learned yesterday that it was 6. The original reports had been 5. We learned yesterday that it was 6, but they said only one of the bullets was fatal or would have been and was. And so it was unclear to me whether the guy who was firing blindly into the room was the guy who shot Breonna Taylor, whether more than one officer shot Breonna, all of this, right? Still trying to work it out. So we learned a couple of things yesterday. First, we learned that Kentucky did an investigation at the same time that the FBI did an investigation. And what we learned yesterday about the results of the grand jury and other things that were said by Daniel Cameron, who is the Attorney General of the state of Kentucky, they only represent, as far as the legal conclusions, they only represent the state government. There is still a chance of federal charges coming at these officers. So one of the officers, and the names aren't that important to me, was determined by the FBI to have fired the one shot that the coroner said was fatal. The Kentucky investigation said they couldn't reach that conclusion, and based on ballistics, they couldn't determine which officer fired the shot. So you have that difference there. But the guy the FBI named was not the guy who fired blindly into this room, and turned out to be, as I predicted, the only guy who would face charges. But when I say as I predicted, that doesn't actually mean I got this right. I got it, I'd say, more wrong than right, actually. So this guy's name is Hankison, Hankison. That's his last name, the officer who was charged. But what he was charged with was wanton endangerment. What he was charged with was not just, in fact, not at all, that he fired into Breonna Taylor's apartment, not being able to see what he was shooting at. What he was charged with was 3 counts of wanton endangerment, meaning putting in danger recklessly the lives of 3 people, a man, a pregnant woman, and a child, who lived in the next apartment from Breonna Taylor, because his bullets went through Breonna Taylor's walls and into that next apartment. Nobody in that next apartment was hit by a bullet. But because of the way he was firing, the position he was firing from, the direction in which he was firing, and firing blindly, his shots put at risk the lives of people who were completely uninvolved in the situation, and that is what he was indicted for. One count for each of the three people in that apartment. I do believe he was offered he was offered bail of $15,000, that he posted bail and did get out of jail. Now, the original story, and this part doesn't seem to have changed. In fact, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend has said this to police. He said he heard a knock. He says he did not hear the police identify themselves as police. This is an issue of contention right now because the story was originally reported as a no-knock raid. And in fact, it's continuing to be reported that the warrant itself was for a no-knock raid. But the Kentucky Attorney General says that not only did the police say that they announced themselves, but that they had one corroborating witness, apparently a neighbor, not a member of law enforcement, who said he or she, they don't identify the neighbor, but who said that he or she heard the police identify themselves. In any case, it seems likely that if the police identified themselves, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend didn't hear them. His name was Kenneth Walker. So, next thing Breonna Taylor, we can only guess, and her boyfriend, Mr. Walker, know, there's a noise at the door. They know that Breonna Taylor's previous boyfriend, who is the guy that is really the subject of all this stuff the police are doing, searching for drugs or other things around town, but she's not involved with him anymore. They, according to Walker, thought that it might have been him. He's a bad dude. They thought it might have been him coming to do who knows what. So Walker had a legally possessed handgun. Again, he says he didn't hear the police identify themselves. And I'm inclined to believe him, by the way. I mean, the guy's not a criminal. They weren't looking for him. They had no reason to think the police would come to their place. They weren't doing anything wrong, as far as we know. So it seems to me that someone in that position would not take a shot at a police officer if he had actually heard the police officers identify themselves. Right? So the next thing they know is the cops, somebody, they don't know at that point that it's the cops, breaks down their door. They use a battering ram, knock the door off the hinges, and come in. It's still dark. Mr. Walker takes one shot, hits a police officer in the leg. And then, as I understand the story, there are two police officers coming that way, and one, Hankison, who went to another location, like a window on another side, something like that. And the police officers all just absolutely unload. I think two of them fire maybe 10 rounds, and one of them fires 16 rounds, something of that order. And maybe we can discuss whether that's reasonable. I'm not a law enforcement officer. I want to be a little careful about that, but I would not mind getting the opinion of some law enforcement folks, if you're listening this morning, as to whether you think that sounds reasonable, firing 36 shots into a dark room in response to one shot fired your way. Maybe it is reasonable. After all, in some of the firearms training that I've done, you're taught to fire until the threat is gone. I don't know how you think you know how you think you're going to know that the threat is gone if you can't see what you're shooting at. That's a part that really bothers me. A listener points out, and this is absolutely right, and this goes to Hankison more than the other two guys. When you do firearms training, whether as a civilian or as law enforcement, and even to a substantial degree, military, one of the basic rules is that you know your target and beyond. In other words, especially in a time of stress when you're not just standing there, taking your time, shooting at an immobile paper or metal target or something, right? In a time of stress, you're moving, your adrenaline is fired up. You don't know if your target is moving. Normally they would be. You know, if you're a police officer and you got a target that isn't moving, then, you know, that might change what you do a little bit, depending on the situation. You got to know what's beyond your target. You got to know that you're not going to hurt or kill somebody else. And Hankison ignored that. Anyway, let me get back to this. So one shot was fired by Walker. Something on the order of 36 rounds were fired by police in response. And what the Attorney General of Kentucky said yesterday, said after intense, thorough research, studying of the law and the situation at hand, they determined that the police returning fire, even that amount of fire, is justifiable use of force under Kentucky law once Mr. Walker took one shot at them. And this might be something that Kentucky lawmakers want to look at, or maybe after discussion with law enforcement and others, they might decide that the law is okay as it is. Look, I'm not a cop. I can't tell you that I know what the right answer here is. My gut instinct, after doing some firearms training, including training with law enforcement a couple of times, again, not claiming to be an expert at all, my gut instinct is firing 36 shots into a dark room after one shot coming your way is too much. Especially the dark room part, right? If you could see what was going on and you saw, and it was light out, and there's a bad guy with a gun, and so the bad guy can see you, and you know that he knows that he's shooting at police officers, and he takes a shot and, you know, hits a cop in the leg, and you know that he knows that he's shooting at cops, and they all open up at the same time to stop him, and 36 rounds get sent his way. And that's not exactly what happened with Breonna Taylor, because the guy who shot at cops didn't get shot. It was Miss Taylor that got killed. But and the cops open up on the guy who's shooting at them, and he gets hit with a whole bunch of bullets and dies. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. He knew he was shooting at a cop, and you knew that he knew. And you can see him, and you can make sure that you understand what's beyond your target. But in this situation, where the person in the room might not have heard you identify yourself. And by the way, let me talk about one other thing. And I think this is even more of a macro point than what happened. Last night, 2 Louisville police officers were shot as part of the protests in that town, that were a reaction to what happened with Breonna Taylor, the lack of indictments relating to her death. In short, none of the police officers was charged with anything that related to her dying. Okay? 2 cops were shot. They were not seriously wounded. As of yesterday evening, One of the officers was alert and stable. The other was in surgery, but he is not thought to have a life-threatening injury, and the police officers should be okay. Still, 2 police officers were shot yesterday. Here's what I want to talk about for a minute, though, in a more macro kind of way. Based on the story as we heard it yesterday, the police officers expected that Breonna Taylor would be at home alone. They also did not believe that she was involved in drug trafficking. The connection between her and drug trafficking was very tenuous to begin with, namely that they had reason to believe that her ex-boyfriend had once or twice had a package delivered at the house. The ex-boyfriend drug dealer who has been arrested has told police that Breonna Taylor had never had anything whatsoever to do with any kind of drug trafficking. But the police were apparently looking for drugs. So they're looking for drugs, and they believe that a 26-year-old female EMT, they believe she's probably home alone. Why is that situation one where the cops would go in the middle of the night and break down a door with a battering ram in order to look for drugs where they think a 26-year-old woman who is not a drug dealer is alone? This is ugly. And this is all part of this outrageous, far too long-lasting war on drugs in the United States of America. Now, I know I'm way more libertarian than most people. If it were up to me, I'd legalize everything. I wouldn't pick that as, my hill to die on, right? I wouldn't pick that as my number one issue if I ever ran for office, which I almost certainly won't. But the idea that the police are going to go to extremes like this and risk killing people to prevent adults from doing what adults want to do with their own bodies, even if I've never touched an illegal drug in my life. I've never even smoked a cigarette. I'm not standing here promoting drug use. But how is it a reasonable thing for government to be so aggressively in the business of prohibiting adults from doing what they want to do in the privacy of their own homes, that they engage in an arguably no-knock raid that results in a death like this? It's completely unnecessary, and this country needs to do some serious rethinking. We'll be back.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Michael Brown at 2, 630 KHOW, Denver.